So today I'm going to show you how to produce an animation very similar to this one, except I think we'll do a sunset type scene for a change, with some nice shimmering water, a few birds flying about, and maybe something else happening, who knows. So let's just get on with that. The first thing you're going to need is the latest version of Blender from blender.org. It needs to be at least Blender 2.78. If you've got an older version, this is just not going to work for you. If it's a later version, well, I'll show you what to do about that in a moment. Okay, so we'll click outside here. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of our default cube, so press X and delete. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a grid. Now before we do anything with the grid, I want to take these subdivisions down here up. If you haven't got this menu on the left here, you can hit T to hide it and to bring it back. Then we want to change these subdivisions to 30 and 30. And I'm going to change the size here to 5, and lo and behold, this is what we get, a grid. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the lamp as well, because we'll be producing our own lamp. Now we want to position our camera, so I'm going to go view front, and I'm going to take us up a bit from there, something like that. View, align view, align active camera to view, bang, like that. Okay, now we want to make this a bit bigger, I expect, so that we can see it all in the camera, because this is going to be our water. Now the other thing we can do is bring the camera closer, and in fact that's what I'm deciding to do. One of the benefits of using front view is that the axis arrows work, and there you can see I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to scale this up so that the corners are lost in the edge, because I'm not actually going to move the camera during this little demonstration here. I am however going to move the plane away, something like that. I'm going to have to scale it up again. I'm going to scale it in X only, so SX, just to lose those corners, and there we go. Now next thing we're going to do is set up our backdrop, and our backdrop is going to be an evening sky. So if we go into cycles render, that's very important, and we want to click on the world symbol here, use nodes, and we'll click on this little dotty thing, and we want an environment texture is what we want. And there's nothing special about an environment texture. You can get away with using any image as long as it's about twice as wide as it is high. And I'm going to open up a sky, and this is a sky picture that's taken with some mountains in the background, and you can find loads of these. I've altered this one very slightly in GIMP because I didn't quite like the colours. So sky, evening, mountains, that's the one. Double click on there, and I think we'll leave that at that for the moment. Now I'm going to go over into our compositing screen, and I'm going to hit the shader nodes and the world, and there you can see we have our image texture there. Now I want the ability to spin this around so that the sun's in the right place and the mountain's in the right place. So how do you do that? Okay, very simple. The first thing you need is a texture coordinate node, and the second thing you need is a mapping node. Which is from the vector menu. Oops, didn't want that to go in there. Never mind A. At least it's given us some place that we can put things. So let's move that over there, move that up there. Now you want the generated output into vector. You want the vector to vector, and you want colour to colour. And now if we switch this to our rendered mode, or even our texture actually, no, I think it'll have to be rendered mode, and we can see we've suddenly got this background. Now what we need to do is to spin it about, and how do we do that? We use the rotation in here. Z obviously spins it round and round, so I'm going to spin it around and then I'm going to spin it around the x-axis to bring one way. And lo and behold, we have our mountain up here. Well, that's very good. So let's just check what's going on. If I render that now, see I've got a sky plus some distant mountains. And I think I need to take that further down, 0.1 maybe. That's probably good enough. So we'll just hide that, and now the time has come to look at the water. Well, this is what I was saying earlier on. If I go to materials, we'll add a new material. Now if you're on a later version than 2.78, if you click on settings down here and see if you've got a section called displacement in settings, not this displacement up here, that's something else. If you haven't got a displacement in settings, then we need to come to our camera picture here, and where it's got feature set, we want experimental, and this allows us to use modifications of the surfaces of our objects using textures, which is often called micro displacement. So we've done that, and we'll now go back to our material here, and you can see now we've got this new displacement thing appeared here, and we want to set that to true. Then we want to go over to our tool spanner, whatever you call it here. We want to add a modifier. That's going to be a subdivision surface, and you need to click here where it says adaptive. And what that does is it allows Blender to throw in as many vertices in this grid here as it likes as it gets nearer to the camera, and it makes for a very detailed rendering of textures. So back to the material, and we're going to go into compositing, and we want, this time we want to click on the little box down here which gives us our actual materials, and for the moment we'll forget about that. I'm going to leave it as white for the moment. I'm going to add in a shader. This is just temporary so we can see what we're doing, and that's going to be another diffuse shader, and I'm going to add in a mix shader, and this one I'm going to make black, like so. So we've now got a 50-50% mix of black and white. But what we want is a texture that's going to give us the rises and swells of the sea, or in this case a lake. So I'm going to add in another texture. This time it's going to be a Voronoi texture, which from my experience I know is probably the best for doing this. We're going to take the factor to our factor here, and instantly we can see we've got these shapes, and I'm going to take the scale up, which reduces the size of the, from memory I think I was somewhere around about 40, which looks about right there. So that's created, or would create if we put some displacement on it, some dimples in the water, but that's not really good enough. We need them to be stretched out into ripples, and the way we do that is by adding in another texture mapping node, connecting vector to vector, and you'll notice it's disappeared. That's because we don't have an input into here. So we want a texture coordinate input as well. Sling that over there, and we want generated. This is what we want. Now we want to stretch this out in the X direction. So I want to stretch it quite a way actually. Or is it the X? No, it's the Y direction. This gets a bit confusing because textures, it always confuses me because these numbers work in a very counterintuitive way. So we're going to stretch that out in the Y direction until we get some ripples. We're going to stretch it out in the Z direction slightly. Perhaps. No, I think that's not good enough. Okay, so that's that done. Now the other thing you can do is obviously play with rotation. We're going to be playing with location, but not until later. And it's worthwhile noting that in the X there should, yeah, that moves the whole texture, if you like, backwards and forwards into or out of the scene. Let's set that back to 0. Right, so now we've got something to put bumps on. Let's go and put bumps on something. Keep that mix shader, we still need it. I can get rid of that black, hit X, and I'm going to disconnect that. I'm going to add in another node, and this is going to be a vector node, and it's a bump node. I'm going to take the factor into the normal, take the normal into displacement. And we'll render our image again. This time it'll take a little longer because it's working out what to do with that sea surface. As you can see, we have a wonderfully lumpy sea, and that's going to be too lumpy for our purposes. We want to flatten that down. So I'm going to hit the escape key, go back into compositing. I'm going to make that 0.1. And we'll probably also need a maths node as well. So I'm going to put in a maths node in there, set it to multiply. I'm going to leave that as it is for the moment. We'll probably have to adjust that a bit later. Right, so we don't want to add a diffuse. What we do want is a glossy shader. Take the roughness down to very nearly 0 and move that into the top of our mixture there, and I'm going to add in a translucent shader. Make the colour a bit green, dull it down a little bit. And we need another mix shader. Now you might be asking why I don't use glass for the sea. I could do, but I've found out that it doesn't give you a terrifically good result when it comes to realism. So as well as our translucent shader, we're going to add in a transparent shader, wherever it is. And then the output from that goes to the bottom of here. and you can see instantly what we've got, but you can see our strength is still too great. Wow. Bump. So hang on. .05 maybe. And 0.05. And that's a bit better. What we might want to do is stretch it out a bit more on the y-axis. But in actual fact, I'm going to render first, because I found that this render view that Blender actually provides isn't a very good indicator as to what the damn thing looks like. So there we go. Now, mix between the glossy and the translucent, what we want to do is take our factor there, and we'll go out. And we'll render that again. And we've got a fairly subtle riddle effect, which doesn't look anything like what we just saw. This is not a surprise to me. Right, so I've taken it down a little bit too far now. So back into compositing. Take that back up to maybe 0.2. You see, what it does is it remembers the last time you rendered it, and we can hit render image in here as well if we like, and the rendered image will come out down here. And this is just to see what our new values actually look like. And we're still perhaps a little bit too low. So we'll take this up to 0.15 or thereabouts. Cancel the render. Re-render. And there we go, that looks a bit better. Now the next thing we want to do, having sorted out those materials, is to add our sun. So let's go back to our default window layout, hide the render view, cancel the render, sorry, hide the render view, and we're going to add in our sun. And we want to go back into render view here because we want to be able to see it. So, but not yet, hey. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a UV sphere. There it is. Just a plain old vanilla UV sphere. And I'm going to scale it down. And I'm moving it backwards. It's important that it goes, to get the glints on the water, it's important that it goes just in front of the back edge of the water there. Go back to camera view and into texture, no, into rendered view. You can see it there. Now what you can't see is the handles, so you're just going to have to use G, Z to move it in the Z direction, like so. And G X to move it in the X direction. We're going to put it there. I'm going to scale it down a bit more because that's going to be very insanely bright. So over here we're going to click new material. I'm going to leave the colour, no I'm not, I'm going to shift the colour towards yellow somewhat, and it wants to be an emission shader, and the strength wants to be around about 2000. And you can see we've got these nice shimmers on the water here, and it's a good idea to render this just to see if we've got everything looking about right. And this rendered image will allow us to do some compositing, which is the next stage. Because we need to tie all this in together, and compositing will help us do that. Now, we go into our compositing window. This time we're going to click on this picture icon here, which takes us into compositing. We're going to hit nodes, going to click on backdrop, and we're going to add in just one node. And can anyone guess what that is? It's a glare node. So that goes in there, and we want to add in an output node so we can see it as the backdrop, which is a viewer node. Connect that to the image on here as well. There we go. And if we come over to this menu over here, we want to drop down the zoom until we can see just about the whole picture, which helps. We're going to be doing our first bit of animation in a minute. So, I like to have 5 streaks, not 4. And I'm going to add in a second glare node actually. It's going to go in there. And this one's going to be set to fog glow, high quality, and the threshold we're going to whack it way the heck up. And if I set this one up to high quality as well, you see how it reduces things. Now, we don't want quite so much of a glow around things, so I'm going to take that threshold up even further. I've got a funny feeling on the last picture it was around about 70. The size, we can either drop it down, not that far, eh? Something like that. So that's our fog glow. And our threshold on here, well, we want to set the colour modulo further up. And our threshold on here can be high but not that high. And we still want to get some of these occasional sparks. there, something like that. Fade we can turn down. Number of iterations, I think I was on 5. Maybe not. And I think that will do for the moment. Now, you need to decide how long your animation is going to be. If I pull this panel along here, and we're set at 250 at the moment, I'm going to go for 200, which is 8 seconds, which I think is plenty. And in fact, I'm going to cheat, because very often what I'll do is I'll stretch it out to double the length, which is what I did with the one you've already seen. So we're at frame 1. Now, handily enough, we can, if we go back to, if I right click on the lake down here and go back to our material, handily enough we can actually set keyframes on these as well. So I'm going to hover my mouse button over there, I'm going to press I, and then I'm going to scrub to go right the way to the other end. You can use the toolbar here, right the way to the other end there, and I'm going to set these up. And the main problem with this is deciding which goes in which direction. Now we know when we scale Y up, it spreads out to the left and right. So if we move X, then that should say it goes backwards and forwards, and logic would say probably minus is towards us. So I'm going to make that minus, not a lot, minus 0.2 will probably do us, and that should make the ripples come towards us. And I'm going to put in a little bit of Z in there as well, but not a lot. 0.05, and that will make the ripples change shape, because they're kind of dropping through the plane. Now I'm going to hover my mouse over again, I put a second keyframe in, and I'm going to click down here, go to the graph editor, and you can see we've got these things here. The important thing to do is to go to keyframes, interpolation mode, and make it linear. Otherwise these movements are going to speed up and slow down. Not very good. Now there's something else that I want to animate as well, and just turn this back to a node editor, which is what it was. If we go back to the compositing screen, and the other thing I want to animate is the angle offset on our streaks. And here's an angle offset there, so I'm going to hit and go back to the beginning. I found in the past it always looks a lot better if you animate this angle here when you've got streaks. So we've gone back to the beginning, we've pressed I on angle offset. If we go to the end, I'm going to take angle offset up to about, I don't know, about it's going to be rotating too quick, about 60 degrees, 70 degrees, something like that. Press I again, and we need to do the same thing again with the graph editor. We want the keyframe, interpolation mode, linear. Because Blender's helpful to animators, usually when you animate something you want it to speed up and slow down at the end of each movement, and Blender does this automatically, but if you don't want it you can just go back into Graph Editor and do what I've just done to actually change it. Go back to default, and we can render our image again. Right, so what I've done is I've rendered the first 20 frames of an animation just to check on the water movement. So if I hit play rendered animation now, and we can see the water's going the wrong damn way. And this is the really weird thing, the scale doesn't work the same as the actual location on textures. It's very strange. But you can see the water's moving and we've got little sparkles, which is the good thing. Now we need to fix that, and the other thing I need to fix is the texturing. Is the spread of light on the water isn't quite right, and the background is too misty. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up GIMP and I'm going to change this background. So I'm going to open our Sky Evening Mountains scene here, and this is what I use for the background, and I'm going to change the colours on it to make it less misty, and hue, saturation and lightness. I'm going to take the lightness down quite a bit, and the saturation down a little bit, and hopefully that will do it. So now I can overwrite Sky Evening Mountains, export it, come out of GIMP, and if I now reload that texture, so I'll go to our world symbol here, and you can see that's a lot better. Right, so we need to sort out this water, and to do that I'm going to go into Compositing, and I want to take this roughness here up, but I don't want to take it too much. So 0.08, something like that, roughness on the gloss, and you can see that's spread it out immediately. And if I go into default and render our image, and we can revisit our compositing to change it, and you can see that looks a lot better instantaneously. And for those of you who ask what on earth does this translucent mixture and transparent mixture do, and what it does is it adds in this little green streaks here in the waves, and this would be even more important if our ripples were higher, and this is the reason why water often appears greener the closer it is. So that's a lot better. Now we want to sort out the direction that our water is moving in and our compositing. I'll do the compositing first. And after a bit of fiddling about, this is what I've come up with. I've swapped the two glares around so the streaks are in front of the fog glow, and these are the settings that I've got, which obviously you can copy if you want to. but just play around until you get it to look right the way that you actually want it. I've also turned the lamp down a little bit. I've gone down to 1000 from 2000, and that's improved things very slightly. Okay, so here we are. You can see the ripples are now spreading towards us in the way that I wanted. And there's some nice little details going on, like this wave curling over here, and that's absolutely brilliant, and that's exactly what I'll leave it as. So how did I do that? Well, after a bit of fiddling about, I found out that I needed to put a figure of 0.5 in the Y. It's as simple as that. So that's that done. Now the next thing is to do some movement in the scene, and usually a scene like this I'll put birds in, and so I'll show you how to do that. So let's go back into our default view, get rid of the render view, go back into solid viewport shading, and I'm going to go to another layer which will get rid of all this stuff which is confusing us, and I want to model a bird. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to actually animate this. I want to have the wings move. Now in order to be able to do that, because this is going to be part of a particle system, the only way I can really do it is by using a thing called vertex animation, which allows me to distort it and replay a distortion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the visibility of that subsurface, go back into edit mode, oops, be in object mode still, and you see here where this little triangle is, that's object data, and we want to give it some shape keys. So we're going to give it the first one, and that's what they call basis, which is the wing down position, and we're going to give it another one, which is key 1, which I'm going to double click, and I'm going to call that wing up, if I can spell. That's the one. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm just going to have to play with it to get it right. So I need to go into edit mode, and B for bulk select. And that'll do. I don't want it to flap more than that, and that will do me completely. So now if I go back into object mode, you'll see it's gone back to where it was before, and that's because we now have this value here that we can change. We'll make the wings move, which is pretty cool. And I don't want much more movement than that. It's just to make the birds seem different. So that's the way it's going to go. Now we want the material, new, and I'm going to try out making it a glossy material, because then it will reflect the background. It'll look more like a bird. I know it seems a bit daft. Give it a little bit of roughness, but this is just a try out. Go back to our tools, re-enable that subdivision surface so you can see that, and that looks fine. By hitting the M key to our normal layer that we're using, and we can see we've got a huge bird in the middle of it. And the first thing I want to do is I want to scale it down somewhat. Then I want to move it out of the way. It doesn't really matter where it goes, it can go absolutely anywhere. So I'm going to put it down here, which is well out of the way of casting any strange huge bird shaped shadows, and that will do fine. I want to rename it. It's no longer a cube, it's a bird. And this might confuse a few of you, but I'm going to duplicate it in a minute, but not before I've actually applied some animation. So I'm going to go back to the first frame. I'm going to go into this wing up. I'm going to set the value to 0, and I'm going to hit the I key. Okay. Now we're going to go into the graphs editor and we're going to use some modifiers. So we need to hit the N key to get this menu here up, and we want modifiers. We want to add a modifier. And that's pretty cool, and that will do us, I think. Right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate it a couple of times. And the reason for this is I don't want everything to be one animation. All the birds doing everything at the same time. In fact, I'm going to duplicate it another time as well. There we go. So we now got a group of birds, and we're going to make them into a group of birds. So I'm going to select all of them, and to objects, group, create new group, and you'll see the reason for doing this in a moment. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select them all individually, go into the graph editor, and I'm going to change some parameters. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the phase offset, so they're flapping at different times. And now if we scrub through, we'll see they're all doing different things, which is what we want. Hooray! Right, now for our next mysterious thing, I'm going to add in a icosphere. And this is going to be the object which our birds are going to come from. And if I go to view top, and I'm going to scale it S in the Y direction, this just lets our birds appear from a S in the Z direction. So let's have birds appear from a number of locations and not just from one. Move it over here, go to camera view, and I'm going to move it in. Now it doesn't really matter if this object shows, but what I don't want to show is a bird suddenly appearing. So view top, I'm going to rotate it a bit in order to avoid that. Go back to the camera, pull it in a bit further, and that'll do. Right, now we want to add a particle system. We do that by hitting this little sparkly thing here, new. How many birds do we want? Well, we don't want 1,000 birds, do we? That's going to be a bit silly. Maybe 15. You could have 1,000 birds if you wanted to. Now, here's the thing, that this is a little tip which took me ages to figure out this one. I'm going to start them 120 frames before the animation starts. You never used to be able to do that and have it work, but it does now. The end is 200, which is correct, but our lifetime of 50 is wrong. I'm going to put 1,000 on there because we don't want these ever to die. We want them to keep going. There we go. And we're going to omit them from the faces. It's going to be random. We don't necessarily want the even distribution. Forget about velocity and stuff at the moment because we're going for Boids, which is American speak apparently for birds. And there we are. So let's have a look and see how big they come out at. We'll go down here first, render, We don't want to render the emitter, which is the icosphere. We want to render a group. Here's the group, funnily enough called group, and it's going to be pick random, and yeah, so what size are we? Don't know. Right, we've just got separate and flop at the moment, and that's not much use. We want to give them a target to fly to, so I'm going to add in an empty, lift that up off the deck, move it over there for the moment, might move it again later, might even animate it. Go back to our icosphere, and we want to give them a target which is called goal, and what we want to go towards is our empty, which is there. And now if I go back to the beginning and scrub this in here, you can see we've got birds coming out and wandering about and doing all sorts of things, but they're not going towards their target. It's because our target isn't very high priority. So that's going to be the first thing that I want to do, go to the target. There we go, that's much better. And how big are they? Well, funnily enough, they're about the right size, but I want to give them a bit of random size. So let's go back up here to physics, random size, give them some random size, and maximum airspeed there is 10, that's much too fast. We want to give them a maximum airspeed of about 4. We want to give them a minimum airspeed as well, otherwise they'll stop and drop out of the air, won't they? Well, they won't, they'll just hover there like it's anti-gravity time. And these are all settings that I kind of remember. Right, air personal space, right up to the maximum. So we want them to spread out. So if we now go back to the beginning again, you can see that we're flying in the wrong direction, but then I'll sort that out in a minute. You can see that at the moment they're flying towards their right wingtip, which means we need to turn these birds around. So if I go into the render here, we want to click on rotation, and now they're probably flying backwards. Yes, they are. So we still need to turn them around. But what rotation lets us do is to take these birds down here, spin them around, select all of them, oops, select all of them, RZ180, so I have them all going the other way. Now if we go on the top and zoom in on them, you see they're flying the correct direction. Like so. Much better, hey? So this is what we've got so far. We've got birds that fly across the scene, turn around, and they want to gather around this target. Now, that's not really very interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this target. I'm going to take it down a bit. Maybe there, and I'm going to add in an animation keyframe. So now our birds go round, till they get to there. And actually I'm going to go there. I'm going to take it up. So the birds are definitely going to have to fly across the sun. And I'm going to insert a location keyframe there. So now what's going to happen is our birds will come out, going to fly up towards the sun, going to drop down, and fly off into the distance. So let's have a look and see what that looks like. View camera. Now you'll notice how birds at the moment, they're flying into the water. That's not a problem. We can add in another rule. So let's go back to our icosphere. Going to add in another rule. That rule is going to be avoid collision, and no, it's not. So that. Going to add in another rule. All right, it's not going to be avoid collision. It's going to be avoid. Avoid collision is avoid collision with each other, which they kind of do anyway. The object is going to be the grid. And now we should find that our birds definitely do not want to go through that grid. There we go. Now we've got some quite nice realistic bird animation. Not all flapping at the same time. So that's that. Now all that's left for me to do, because that's all I plan to do, is to animate the finished product. So if I stop the animation player, how do we do that? Well, I'm going to come down here, and the only real thing that I need to do is in the sampling. I want to take the render samples up to 55, I believe, and really that's all I need to remember to do. So I'm going to render it and show you the final result. So here we are, this is the output after a little bit of tiddling around, and I've done a few things to it, and I've slowed it down 50% in the video editor, as was my plan, and it doesn't look at all bad, even if I do say so myself. So let's go and take a look and see exactly what I've done to it. We are back in Blender. I made a few slight changes to the compositor, and I've added in these two posts that are down here. I changed the material on the birds, so the birds now have a gloss and a diffuse. and the diffuse is a little bit off-white towards the grey. And I found myself doing this because the birds were too reflective. When they went anywhere near the sun, we had some problems. So I fixed that in that way. And there's the two posts. I've changed the camera angle slightly. I've lowered the camera and twisted it around so that the sun's in about the same place, but we're lower to the water. And really that's about it. That's about all I've done. Oh, I added a few more birds. There's 15 now, I think it is. And yeah, so I'll show you what the birds actually do now. I'll highlight them. And I changed this so that it animates down towards the surface of the water and then off into the background, just to add a bit of interest in the way the birds were flying. And that was about it. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and have a go. It's good fun. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.